All right. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Macagliano there on the East Coast. Looks like we still got some people trickling in, but it is 1100, so we'll go ahead and get this kicked off. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Like to just do a little intro for our guest speaker and maybe a little bit of a talk about an intro to what he's going to be talking about today. So once again, thank you everybody for joining the Strategic Sealift Officer Detachment 71 here at Cal Maritime today. My name, for those of you who haven't met me before, is Lieutenant William Brickham. I'm a 2012 graduate of the California Maritime Academy and one of 3 naval science instructors assigned to our officer commissioning program here. Me personally, as a strategic sealift officer and actively sailing merchant mariner, it's always really surprised me how closely intertwined our naval forces and the merchant fleet are, but how little each community knows about each other. For those of you who don't have a military background, this relationship can really be summed up in one word, and that's sealift. Simply put, sealift is the utilization of cargo ships, civilian cargo ships, to deploy military cargo. When we talk about the word sealift in strategic terms, though, it's an assessment of our nation's combined ability to project and sustain power around the world. With well over 90% of our military assets being transported by sea, this kind of assessment requires a deep understanding of U.S. maritime strategy, the capabilities and limitations of our merchant marine, and what I believe to be one of the most important requirements, a keen awareness of the successes and failures in our past. With that said, the SSO detachment is honored to host Dr. Sal Macagliano, Associate Professor of History at Campbell University and Adjunct Professor with the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Transportation from the State University of New York Maritime College, along with a second mate unlimited tonnage license, a Master's in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University, and a PhD in Military and Naval History from the University of Alabama. A former merchant mariner, he sailed and worked ashore for the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command and is the author of Fourth Arm of Defense, Sealift, and Maritime Logistics in the Vietnam War. Dr. Macagliano, once again, thank you for joining us today. And with that said, I'd like to offer you the floor.
Thanks, Will. I want to thank everybody at Cal Maritime for the invite coming out here. It's a pleasure, metaphorically, to be out there. I am at my home in North Carolina, so I hope to get out to Vallejo sometime in the near future. So with that, what I'd like to do today is talk about strategic sealift and the U.S. Merchant Marine. This is a talk I've given a few times now, and one of the reasons I enjoy giving this talk is because I like having the opportunity to especially educate people on the different areas of sealift and how it rolls into our overall national defense strategy, but also what the U.S. Merchant Marine looks like today. Right now, we find ourselves really on a precipice of the U.S. Merchant Marine. Where's it going? What's the future going to hold for it? And I'll come back to that at the end and really want to link that together. So what I want to talk about today with you is the 4 elements or the 4 sides of a pyramid that are built on our national defense strategy in terms of the U.S. Merchant Marine. And those 4 elements are fleet support. This is the direct support to the U.S. Navy, the Afloat Prepositioning program, which are really the merchant ships that are on the cusp of the razor's edge out there. They would be the first ones to go into areas to offload. The Strategic Sealift Fleet, which is made up of vessels from the Department of Transportation's Ready Reserve Force and the Military Sealift Command. And then finally, Sustainment, which is made up of ships of the Maritime Security Program, the Jones Act, and basically the commercial U.S. Merchant Marine. So I'm going to talk about each of those 4 in a little bit of detail, talk about a little bit of their history, where they're at today, where they're going, and also make sure I want to leave enough time here at the end. I'll go to about 1:45, so that if you guys have questions and guys and girls, sorry, have questions, I'm more than willing to field them, and hopefully I'll have answers for them. So one of the things I would recommend, and again, being the historian that I've become, I always got to recommend things. So in this month's Proceedings, the United States Naval Institute Proceedings, is this article from Nicholas Lambert. What is a Navy for? Strategic purpose is not the same thing as operational necessities. I would make this required reading of everybody out there. I think Nick Lambert's piece here is absolutely magnificent. He puts into context what a lot of people talk about in terms of Navy, sea power, merchant power, you name it. And he goes right back to talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan, which everyone loves to quote, but no one wants to read. And what he says is basically that the whole reason for the US Navy in the 1890s and going forward was to protect the merchant marine. It's commercial. It's not military. This is what made the British great. It wasn't that they had a big navy. It's that their big navy was protecting their commercial interests. And that was an element that's absolutely essential there. This piece, again, in this month's Naval Institute Proceedings, it's great. It's part of their American Sea Power series. It's great. Every month they're coming out with that. So if you have an opportunity to go read this, I really strongly recommend it. I think it will make you think a little bit different about the relationship between the Navy and the Merchant Marine. I've seen lots of comments coming from naval personnel about that, which I think is great. Myself, I do a lot of writing myself, and one of the things I write about are really two elements here I write about. The first one, the piece on the left there, was in what's called Sea History magazine. It's the National Maritime Historical Society. That was on the 100th anniversary of the Jones Act. That's available for looking at through their site, seahistory.org. It's a piece that talks about the Jones Act, what the Jones Act entails. A lot of people write about the Jones Act, talk about the Jones Act. There's a vocal lobby against the Jones Act out there. One of the things I will tell you that's misjudged about the Jones Act and not known is that the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 was really this nation's first maritime strategy. It does not just involve coastal cabotage shipping. It was in the intent to build up on what Mahan started in 1890 and talk about what we should have as a national merchant marine. Again, the cabotage issues in Section 27, there are 31 other sections in that act, and all of them dealt with different issues that were essential to understanding that. The other article I have there is one I wrote for Proceedings. This is in their CNO's Naval History contest for 2019. And this one, I basically posed the argument, what if there was a war and the Merchant Marine didn't show up, or we didn't have a Merchant Marine? And what does that mean for us going forward? We've been able to sustain ourselves militarily with a Merchant Marine in every conflict we fought. The problem is, will we be able to do that going forward in the 21st century? What are the limitations of our current Merchant Marine? What's our current limitations in terms of vessels, mariners, infrastructure going forward? And this essay, which as I said, got recognized by the CNOs, which I found very amazing they did, because it didn't deal with Navy issues directly, was able to get a little bit of attention, which I'm happy for. So let's go into the topic at hand here, which is those four elements. Those four elements are built on four different sources of vessels. Basically, the U.S. sources vessels from four different areas. One is the Military Sealift Command, which is the commercial vessels operated by the U.S. Navy, and I'll talk a little bit more about them and their role here in a second. They're the vessels of the Ready Reserve Force. These are the vessels that are maintained by the Maritime Administration. They're a subset of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. And they're the ones that are used in time of war. We would activate in several days' notice, get into the seaports of embarkation, and sail across the oceans to potential areas. We've seen that exercised in the Persian Gulf War of 1990, the Iraq War of 2003, and in a myriad of other exercises going on in operations throughout its history. And then on the right is the U.S. Merchant Marine. A subset of the U.S. Merchant Marine is what's called the Maritime Security Program. These are 60 vessels that receive a direct compensation from the U.S. government, about $5 million per ship per year, to be U.S. flagged and operate on the international trade routes. And the key for those vessels in particularly is they don't just provide shipping, they don't provide just tonnage and TEUs and square footage, but they provide us networks and logistics hubs and trade in the different areas. So we get into the Maersk system, we get into Hauppauge system, we get into APL, which is CMA. We get into all those kind of chains. And then finally, there's the U.S. ocean-going merchant fleet. These are the vessels over 1,000 gross tons engaged in coastal and ocean travel. As of 15 March, there are 180 ships that qualify in that area. And I'm going to go in depth in each of these and talk a little bit about each of them in a little bit more detail here and let you know what each of these do and some of the issues and highlights that we should be aware of. So first, there's the Military Sealift Command fleet. Roughly about 110 vessels commanded by a two-star admiral, rear admiral, based in Norfolk, Virginia. This fleet is larger than any numbered fleet out there. This has more vessels, more tonnage than any other of the numbered fleets out there. It's also a subpart of the U.S. Navy. One of the things that I know you're aware of, but not everyone is aware of it, but 1 out of 5 vessels in the U.S. Navy, out of the 300 so vessels listed in the battle force, 1 out of 5 have civilian mariners on board. And unlike contractors, these are not contractors. Some of them are directly employed by the U.S. government. Some are contract operated mariners. In other words, they come through companies that are contracted to the U.S. government. They are controlling assets that are in the direct unified chain of command. You don't see contractors commanding squadrons in the Air Force. You don't see contractors commanding battalions in the Army. You don't see contractors commanding, units in the Marine Corps. Yet within the U.S. Navy, you do have civilian mariners who are in that unified chain of command. That makes them very unique in terms of their authority. About 60 vessels, half of them are in what's called fleet support. Those are those vessels in red right there. They provide the direct fleet support, which I'll talk about here in a second. And then there are others in kind of a secondary role, which I shouldn't say secondary. That's not a true statement there, but in a kind of a support and combat services role out there. So vessels like sonar surveillance vessels, which operate the SIRTAS system to monitor Chinese submarines. They would be right on the front lines in case of a conflict. The expeditionary fast transport ships that Todd commanded, fleet tugs, salvage vessels, all of those are in that level. And we see them out there. So I want to talk first about this fleet support, these 29 vessels on the left here that provide the direct fleet support to the U.S. Navy. This imagery came out on the internet today. This is a satellite photo, commercial satellite photo in the South China Sea, showing a Arleigh Burke class destroyer and a Henry J. Kaiser class oiler, probably the Pecos or the John Erickson, I'm not sure which one it is, out there being shadowed by a Chinese frigate. And this is the role that merchant mariners play. Merchant mariners man the 15 vessels, the 15 Kaiser class oilers, the 12 Lewis and Clark class supply vessels, the 2 supply class fast combat logistics ships. And they're out there. They provide the immediate support to the U.S. Navy. And what do I mean by immediate support? They're the ones that do the underway replenishment. They come alongside Navy vessels, or Navy vessels come alongside them to be exact. And they provide replenishment, fuel, ammunition, food, toilet paper, you name it. Everything in the world is in these vessels. This is a role that the Merchant Marine has been doing for a long time. Some will sit there and say the very first underway replenishment vessel was the Teluga back in 1972 in Vietnam. That's what I thought for a long time, but it's incorrect. You can go all the way back to 1899 and the USS Alexander, a collier that was actually recrewed with civilian crew to bring coal to the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. And for a long time, the U.S. operated civilian manned shipping. It was a key component. Even if you go back in the age of sail, there were civilian supply ships that supplied the squadrons in the Mediterranean fighting the Barbary pirates, for example, or down in the Caribbean. This underway replenishment job is absolutely essential. It's what gives the U.S. Navy its legs. If you want, there's a lot of issues you can make with Navy vessels today and some issues with construction and everything, but I will hold hands up that the finest combat logistics force vessels in the world are the U.S. And the Kaiser class, which is being phased out here soon by the new Lewis class being built at NASCO in San Diego, are some of these key vessels. But there's a problem associated with this. If you go back to the concept of civilian crewing, one of the things that came out in the 1970s when this was initiated, when the USS Teluga became USNS Teluga, was the MSC vessels would provide the key element of what's called the shuttle ship. They would load cargo at forward bases and run them out to U.S. Navy manned station ships. And then those shuttle ships in turn will be supplied by merchant shipping coming out. So if you read about the U.S. Navy in World War II and you read about Service Squadron 10 or Service Squadron 8, it's great. It's fantastic. One of the things that's left out of a lot of those histories are those dozens, if not hundreds, of War Shipping Administration merchant vessels that bring food and fuel out to those forward bases. Well, in the 1970s, the decision was made, we got to reduce numbers in the Navy. We have to save money, so we'll start doing the civilian crewing. But what has happened since the Vietnam War to the modern day is we have gotten rid of shuttle ships and station ships and replaced them just with MSC vessels. So now MSC vessels have to do basically double duty. They have to sustain the fleet and then run back to forward bases, draw supplies from forward bases that unfortunately are being more and more supplied by foreign flag vessels versus US flag vessels. And one of the problems with that is, number one, you don't have enough vessels. It works great if you're in the Persian Gulf and you're sustaining out of Fujairah, or if you're in Korea and you're supplying out of Yokohama, or if you're or off the coast of Vietnam and you're supplying out of Subic. It's a whole other thing if you're running against the first island chain in the Pacific and you've got to run back to Pearl Harbor, or worse, the West Coast. And now you don't have enough assets to do that. Add to it, go back to this picture right here. If I want to cripple the US Navy's fighting ability here, and I'm this lonely Type 54A frigate, I'm not going to go toe-to-toe against an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. I'm going to get blown up. I'm going to die. There's no way you survive. However, the one you shoot at isn't the Burke. You shoot at the Kaiser. Kaiser is unarmed, has no defensive armament at all. And more importantly, once they're gone, so goes the underway replenishment ability for the US Navy to stay forward. It's a big liability going on right now. And those merchant mariners find themselves on the front line all the time. They are integrated into the US Navy battle groups, and we see them out there on the front lines all the time. So that's the fleet support element that provides 1/4 of that overall Sealift mission. The second one there is afloat prepositioning. I love this photo because this was the notional concept of afloat prepositioning back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was an issue that rose up with Iran. You had the Iranian hostage crisis. You had the flawed attempt to basically rescue the hostages. This is Desert One. And there was a realization that while we were in good position in Europe, we were in good position in Asia, we were in a poor position in the Middle East in terms of bases and supplies. And so one of the concepts that was resurrected from pre-Vietnam days was this idea of basically floating forward depots, renamed maritime prepositioning ships. And the concept was to load to the gunnels these specially built or converted vessels. The joke with maritime prepositioning ships is they're 1/2 roll-on, roll-off ship, 1/2 container ship, and 1/2 tanker. They have a little bit of everything in them. And what you saw beginning in the 1980s was the creation of these 3 maritime prepositioning squadrons, one in the Atlantic, forward deployed to the Med, one in the Indian Ocean at Diego Garcia, and one in the Western Pacific based on the Marianas. And each of them could support an independent Marine brigade, roughly 16,000 Marines for 30 days. They had everything you needed but the Marines and the aircraft. So it's like, add water, an instant Marine brigade. And we saw the concept validated in 1990 in the Persian Gulf. The first units to hit the ground on, with heavy armor support wasn't the 82nd Airborne. It was the 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, followed by the 1st Marine Expeditionary Brigade. And over time, the Marine concept has matured and developed. Unfortunately, some of those original MPS vessels are still out there. They're referred to as legacy vessels. That's a euphemism for old. I like to call myself a legacy historian for that. The Maritime Prepositioning Squadron has been reduced from 3 squadrons down to 2. You've added vessels to them, some of these modified large medium speed ro-ros. You've added a sea basing element to these squadrons that allows them to offload at anchor in a very unique way, as I'll show you. And one of the things that we see is this is a very expensive program. One of the things about maritime prepositioning is you're paying for a vessel 24/7 every day of the year to basically sit there and be ready to go. It's an extremely expensive program for the Marine Corps. And after the Persian Gulf War of 1990, you add an Army element to it. The Army added a squadron, initially 8 large ro-ros. Now it's down to 5. A couple of container ships packed to the gills with ammunition. And the Air Force, same thing, have a couple of vessels that are out there. But the Maritime Prepositioning Squadron, in conjunction with the Army, really gives you a unique capability unlike anybody else on the planet. The Army has brigade sets ashore and afloat. The Marine Corps have their brigade sets afloat and ashore. Theirs is in Norway. That's ashore. And one of the things this allows you to do is not just to land the individual brigade. So for example, in 2003, the Army, the APS-3, which is the Army Prepositioning Set 3, which is the one that's afloat, was able to offload in Kuwait. And that put a brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division ashore. Well, that unit, after it unloaded, went to Qatar and Kuwait and picked up the 5th APS and moved them into position. So you were able to move unit sets around quite quickly around the world. And again, prepositioning is a very unique concept. The problem with prepositioning today is Diego Garcia is a very controversial area, unclear whether we're going to be able to maintain the base there because of ongoing diplomatic relations. The Marianas is within DF-21 range. This is a direct fire missile range, a ballistic missile of the Chinese. And so a lot of question about the utility of these ships going forward. But they do provide a lot of sealift capability. Once they're offloaded, they go back into that common user pool. And a lot of mariners have spent their time floating around Diego Garcia and Guam doing this. Don't know where this is going in the future. They keep talking about replacing and redoing this force. There are proposals to do a big fleet expansion early in the 2000s that kind of went astray. It didn't kind of fall in. But this program right now is definitely one of the key ones out there. The other problem you have with this is the fact it has to swing through key choke points. So for example, if you have to go to Korea or Taiwan, for example, you have to swing through the Straits of Malacca. If you have to go to the Middle East, same thing. These vessels, just like the vessels that are in the fleet support role, are unarmed. They do not have any armament at all on board. And so they would have to be escorted. They would have to be convoyed. And unfortunately, the Navy finds itself in a shortage of convoy vessels. Back in October of 2018, Dave Larder for Defense News got the Navy quoted as basically saying that they don't do escorts, that basically the Navy's, that the Merchant Marine and Marriott are on their own when it comes to getting to places. And that will expose these vessels to a potential risk in case of a peer-to-peer style conflict. So the prepositioning role is definitely an important one. But again, you see it changing. So for example, the image in the upper right there is of one of 2 expeditionary support docks, or ESDs. ESDs are basically modified Alaska class tankers built by NASSCO in San Diego. They can house 3 LCACs on board. But more importantly, they are big enough that they can moor alongside one of these large prepositioning vessels. You can put the ramp down on its deck, and now you can offload that vessel using those LCACs, and you can actually do it beyond the horizon. It'll take you forever because there's a lot of tonnage on an LMSR, and LCACs are fast, but they're not that fast, and they don't carry that much cargo. So it would take you a long time to do it. The other element you have down here is these new expeditionary support bases. What's called the Puller class expeditionary support bases. They're a derivative of the ESDs. These look just like the ships like the John Glenn and the Montford Point, but instead they have a large helideck on board. They can house special operations crews on board. They can launch small boats, drones, you name it. Really, it's basically a mobile floating base out in the middle of the ocean. And they're building at least 5 of them right now. Out of NASSCO. They're under a very unique crewing arrangement. They're actually commanded by a Navy 06, but they have merchant mariner crews on board. This is what's referred to as hybrid manning. The deck, engine, stewards are all merchant mariners, but the command is under a U.S. Navy captain, an 06. Creates a very unique dynamic on board and also raises potential legal issues down the road should those vessels ever find themselves in combat. So that's the second element of that pyramid. The third one is this. This is the Surge Sealift fleet. Surge Sealift falls under 2 entities. This is the Maritime Administration with the Ready Reserve Force and the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command with their Strategic Sealift Forces. So quick little bit of history here. As Will mentioned, I wrote a book on sealift in the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, we were right at the cusp of the fleet, the U.S. merchant fleet, going out of date. It was 1965. The U.S. merchant fleet had been built in the 40s. We're coming up on the 20-year, basically, life expectancy of the vessels. And there was a big issue about rebuilding the U.S. merchant fleet. U.S. shipyards were untouched thanks to World War II, whereas the rest of the world's shipyards had been leveled as a result of World War II. Our prefabrication yards, the yards that built ships like the Liberty, in which were all around the San Francisco Bay Area there, went away because the prefab yards were not the traditional yards. They went away. And we kind of went back to the old style of building vessels, whereas the rest of the world embraced prefabrication. And we were really at the cusp of this big technological change. Well, in rolls the Vietnam War in 1965, and the decision to go deploy American forces in large numbers. We already had forces in Vietnam since the 50s. But then there's the Lyndon Johnson call to put the first air cav into the A Shau Valley. We got to send Mel Gibson off there. So we got to get them from Fort Benning to Vietnam. That's the shortest scene in the movie. They leave out that one little part of getting from Georgia to Vietnam. But to do that, you have to call on the vessels of the U.S. Merchant Marine to do that. You had to call on vessels of the Military Sealift Command, but you also had to call on vessels of the U.S. Merchant Marine. And what's interesting is in 1965, there's a strike going on the East Coast vessels. The East Coast U.S. merchant ships were on strike over what they go on strike about all the time, money and hours. But because of the emergency in Vietnam, they agreed to put that aside, load cargo, and get the Army and the Marines and everybody else over to Vietnam. But the problem was Vietnam was not on the normal shipping paths. Not only was it not on the normal shipping paths, but even when companies added them to the normal shipping paths, they had to make special arrangements because the ports were so slow in Vietnam that you were sitting there days, if not weeks, waiting to offload. And shipping companies aren't going to do that. We just saw what happens when shipping companies go astray with schedules with the Suez. And so the U.S. needed ships to fill those commercial vessels. And it tapped into what was then the National Defense Reserve Fleet. The ships left over from the World War II building program under the Maritime Commission were put in anchorages throughout the United States, 8 large anchorages, one of them right there in Suisun Bay in California. And basically we started pulling 172 vessels out of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. Cost about $500,000 to activate these vessels. It took several weeks to activate them. You had to tow them to a shipyard. You had to get the blanks off the hull, which are welded on the side to prevent water seepage. A lot of repair work. We actually had several shipyard workers killed because of boiler explosions. And it was just not very, very efficient. And after Vietnam, the decision was made that we need to create a subset of the National Defense Reserve Fleet of ships of higher readiness that can be used by the Department of Defense at a moment's notice. Because we would always have the U.S. Merchant Marine to tap into, but they would be on worldwide shipping. They'd be involved in coastal trade. Not enough vessels would be immediately available, as we found out, to move, in the case of 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division to Vietnam. So initially, the plan was to put 30 Victory ships into the Ready Reserve Fleet, or Ready Reserve Force, excuse me. But almost immediately, there were more modern vessels in the National Defense Reserve Fleet. And over time, we've seen this fleet built up. At the eve of Desert Shield in 1990, there were 96 ships in the fleet. By the early 2000s, we were actually late 1990s, early 2000s, we were right around 116 vessels. Today, it's a lot less. We're down to 48 vessels in the fleet that makes up the Ready Reserve Force. 27 roll-on, roll-off, 8 what were fast sealift ships. These are the old SL-7s built by Malcolm McLean in the 1970s. 6 auxiliary crane ships, 2 aviation maintenance ships, 2 heavy lifts, and a tanker. Those make up what is called a Ready Reserve Force. And then you have the 15 vessels of Military Sealift Command. These are large medium speed ro-ros. These are ships that were converted and built after Desert Storm, and some older MPS vessels, these maritime prepositioning vessels that are no longer used. 61 of these. The problem with these 61 ships is this: they're old. They're really old. Average age is about 45 years. You've got a lot of steam powered vessels in here. Steam has gone away. Under IMO 20, there's almost no steam vessels sailing on the world anymore, except within navies and in this fleet. And for the past 2 years, we've seen the U.S. Transportation Command under General Lyons and the Maritime Administration, previously under Admiral Mark Busby, who had been commander of Military Sealift Command, then went on to become Maritime Administrator during the Trump administration. All of them highlighted the fact that there is a critical shortfall in surge sea lift, and they identified numerous concerns. There's a March 2019 testimony by Busby and Lyons it's just for historians. It's gold. It's these guys did not pull any punches. They sat there and said, there's a critical shortfall. We have material degrading of the fleet. We cannot sustain the mission. Add to it, if we have to sustain the fleet for more than 6 months, we do not have enough mariners. Because while we use retention crews, these small cadre crews on these vessels, there's only about 10 out of the necessary 40 to man them. We're going to have a shortfall of 1,800 mariners in the long run. Cal Maritime, my alma mater, SUNY Maritime, Merchant Marine Academy, all the other maritime schools do a great job producing third mates and third assistant engineers. What we're not producing is second mates and second assistants and chief mates and first assistants, and more importantly, masters and chief engineers. And that's where the critical shortfall comes in. And this all got tested in September of 2019. September of 2019, Transcom and MARAD had pigeoned away money to do what they call turbo activation. Now, they do turbo activations every year, where they'll activate a series of vessels, no notice activations, and they test it. But they never did anything like this. In the span of just a few days, they tested 41 vessels. It was a crazy activation. They were going to activate everything. And by the time it's all done, by the end of the year, they had activated 49 out of the 61 vessels in the MARAD fleet. This was just unheard of at this time, this number of vessels to get activated. And it was meant to basically stress test the system. Both MARAD and MSC activated vessels. And it was not good. It was not good. If you read the after action report that was put together by Transcom, it holds no punches. They were supposed to have an 85% success rate. In other words, 85% of the 61 vessels should be ready. The combatant commanders, those are those geographic commanders around the world, Northcom, Southcom, CENTCOM, Indio-Pac, PACOM, AfricaCom, EURCOM, they plan on having 10 million square feet of cargo space available to them for their planning documents. 85% of that is just 8.5 million. Well, they can adjust to 8.5 million. They can make adjustments to that. This test demonstrated that only 41% of the strategic sea lift was available. That's a critical shortfall. That was a critical shortfall, and hats off to Transcom and to the Maritime Administration for not just doing this test, but for publishing the results and showing everybody how graphically we are woefully short in terms of surge sea lift. And again, this has demonstrated a big problem, that in case of a war, in case of a conflict, we will not be suitably ready to surge forces out of the United States across. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether we need 10 million square feet of cargo space. Do we need 61 vessels? Is there a more efficient way of doing this? To counter this, the Navy and MARAD, I will argue, have gone back to 1990 and come up with the lessons from the Persian Gulf War. They want to build new vessels, put them in the reserve fleet, and they want to buy used vessels and replace the older vessels in here with newer vessels. I have criticisms and critiques of both of those that I can share with you later, but suffice it to say that this is a huge critical shortfall. Unfortunately for the U.S. Navy, which oversees this mission, the Sea Lift mission, this is low on their priorities. Understand, when they built the LMSRs, when they built 15 LMSRs, converted 5 others in the 1990s, they had to create a separate National Defense Sea Lift Fund to put money in so that the money could not be robbed by the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, to make sure that money was there to fund this. $6 billion to build 20 vessels, build or convert 20 vessels. They haven't done that yet. As a matter of fact, the National Defense Sea Lift Fund, which still exists as a line item, has 0 money in it. So, until they get serious about putting money in there to buy vessels, it'll be interesting to see, because the Navy's priority is things that shoot and go boom, whereas the Army, the Marines, the Air Force are really interested in vessels that carry cargo and get them overseas. That's why for a long time the Army was in charge of sea lift, not the Navy. That changes in 1949. So strategic sea lift, that element that's based in the United States, it's going to get the first combatant units across, is really in, I would argue, not great condition. And that brings us to the fourth side of the pyramid, which is the U.S. Merchant Marine. This is a slide I've purloined from a former Marit administrator. He used this a lot in his talks. I've updated it as much as I could here, which shows the size of the U.S. Merchant Marine in terms of ship. That's the blue line there, which peaked at 1,242 vessels during the Korean War and is down now as of March 15th. That's the latest Marit report I was able to access, down to 180 ships, down to 180 ships. And then you see the gross tonnage, 7.2 million gross tons. Again, vessels are inherently bigger than they have been in the past. That's not a really good, accurate measure of size because, again, vessels have really gotten bigger over time. But this shows you the size of the Merchant Marine. And to put this more graphically for you, I put this slide together. These are all the vessels that make up the 180 vessels that are in the U.S. Merchant Marine with the companies they're associated with. I had to change things around here a little bit because a lot of ships are owned by sub-companies of groups, but basically put them together here for you. And this is as of 15 March 2021. Roughly around 30 companies are out there with 180 vessels out there. Everything from APL, Matson, Crowley, Maersk, American Ro-Ro Carriers, Hauppauge, Lloyd, Liberty, U.S. Ocean, Sealift, Pasha, Secor, Conco, Phillips, you name it. They're all out there. These are the 180 ships that make up that fleet. These are the ones that, you know, if you want to go out on Jones Act shipping when you graduate as a third mate or a third assistant engineer, this is where you go. I can break this down by unions too, but it gets a little confusing after a while. So I just use this one slide right here to do it. Give you an idea, the U.S. Merchant Marine is built on basically three legs right now, the ocean-going coastal merchant marine. One is basically cargo preference, which was recently brought up again by President Biden in his Buy America issue about making sure that American gets cargo preference. Making sure there's cargo. The only reason you have commercial vessels, to all my military friends out there, is if there's cargo. If there's no profit, there's no ships. And they will not build ships until there's cargo to put them on. And that's one of the classic issues. So that's one leg. The second leg is the Jones Act. This is the coastal trade. This is what requires U.S. flag, U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S. operated vessels to operate in the contiguous United States, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. You add to it the Passenger Vessel Service Act of 1886, which keeps cruise ships out from operating in the U.S. This is the big stink we got with Canada when they shut down the Alaskan trade. And then the Dredge Act of 1906, which requires dredges to be built in the United States. The Jones Act is one of those second legs. And then the third leg is those 60 ships in the Maritime Security Program. Those are those vessels that receive $5 million a year to basically be available to the U.S. government should they need them. And all this is built, I would argue, on a false premise in many ways. I argue with those who oppose the Jones Act all the time. If you don't believe me, follow me on Twitter, and you'll see a fun-filled romp with people who oppose the Jones Act versus me. And my argument, and I go back to that piece I wrote for Sea History, is the original Jones Act, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, creates a holistic national maritime security act. It creates a program that involves not just coastal vessels, but international trade. It involves building, shipbuilding. It involves everything. It involves all that. And it goes in conjunction with the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which creates differentials or subsidies. In the 1980s and 1990s is where you see everything, or actually I'll go even further back than that, the 50s, 60s, 80s, 90s, that period post-World War II, you start seeing things change. Why does the Jones Act fleet decrease? Well, those who critique the Jones Act will tell you, well, the reason the Jones Act is so small is because the Jones Act is flawed. It makes you buy American ships, which are traditionally more expensive. And yeah, they are. But then again, those same critics who work in those think tanks are more expensive than a think tank, consultant I can get out of the Philippines or Bangladesh, for example, because they are paying American salaries. They're not paying Malaysian, Philippine, or Bangladesh salaries. The other issue you have here is things have changed. What has changed in the United States that affects the Jones Act? The interstate highway system, the interstate pipeline system, intercontinental jet aircraft, which don't move cargo as much as they move people. That gets people off railroads and opens up railroads for cargo. Now, all of a sudden, you're not moving as much freight by intercoastal because we can move it by roads. The interstate highway system, our low fuel prices, even though we pay more than we think, it's still lower than what you see in places like Europe. Very low tax rates on roads. That is more economical. I would love to be able to haul cargo from Seattle to Los Angeles by ship, but I'm not going to be able to compete with a truck driver that can do it in 27 hours, on 2 loads of fuel and deliver the cargo directly to the consumer without having to go through the port of Seattle or the port of Long Beach to move the cargo. You're never going to compete with that. Same thing in the 1980s and 1990s when the differentials went out for construction. All of a sudden, the U.S. yards didn't have international trade vessels coming in to be built, and instead they marketed to the one group in town, that was the U.S. Navy. And you saw American ships go overseas to be built, the D8s, the D9s, all these vessels that are in the international trade were being built overseas. And so in the 1990s, after Persian Gulf War, and we realized, man, we may have made a mistake, we create the Maritime Security Program. Initially 47 vessels in 1996, it expands in the early 2000s to 60 vessels. If you did not have the Jones Act, if you did not have the Maritime Security Program, if you remove, for example, the Jones Act, you remove those vessels. If you remove the Maritime Security Program, you remove those vessels. And those that are remaining almost are exclusively under U.S. government contract, operating for Military Sealift Command or the Department of State in their oil transfer programs or in grain programs under basically the cargo preference. There would be no U.S. commercial fleet. Understand, there's no U.S. commercial fleet. There's no mariners getting trained. There's no advancement going up. That means the crews for the Sealift fleet go away. That means there's not enough pool to go into the MSC fleet, which means the Navy would have to crew their vessels, which is a big problem because they just don't have the manpower to crew 60 vessels and an additional 30 others that they would need to crew. This has huge ramifications. And again, what you get is not just the vessels, you get the networks that these companies make. You get that Maersk network, which again provides you an interconnectivity where you can haul military cargo to an FOB, a FOB up in Afghanistan if you need to. That's how you're getting your supplies. You got the Hapag-Lloyd system. You got APL in the Pacific. You got U.S. Ocean, Sealift, Schuyler Lines, and Liberty operating worldwide. You've got Pasha and Matson operating between the Hawaiian Islands. You've got APC and ConocoPhillips doing the Alaska trade. You've got Coastal and Trident up in Alaska doing coastal trade and doing the fisheries. And then you got the Jones Act group, U.S. Shipping, Foss, Crawley, Secor, OSG, Tote. They're operating in and around the United States. And what we do, and I say this a lot to the maritime industry, I've got a lot of press recently talking about what's happened in the Suez. And one of the reasons I make that argument is because we do a terrible job in the maritime industry conveying what we do in the maritime industry. We are great talking to each other. We are terrible, absolutely terrible about talking to people outside the maritime industry. My example is I'm writing a piece right now for Naval Institute Proceedings on the Ever Given. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is the crew of the Maersk Denver, which was the vessel just behind the Ever Given, that was able to crash stop their vessels, prevent their vessel from running into the Ever Given and running ashore. They were the second vessel right behind them. Contacted Maersk, want to talk to Maersk about it? Can't get a comment from Maersk. It's a great story, American seamanship, great kind of element that we can talk about. And again, we do a terrible job of talking about it. And it's not just the present, it's the past too. Give you an idea, World War II. During World War II, the U.S. Merchant Marine lost 9,500 mariners, 733 ships, one of the highest losses of life of any of the branches of military service. At the end of World War II, the U.S. Army wrote this. This is the Army's official history of World War II. It's called the Green Book series. There are 79 volumes like this. 79 volumes, big, huge, massive volumes. 79 volumes like this. 79. Talk about the U.S. Army in World War II. The Merchant Marine got 81 pages. That's it. That's the entire history of the U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II. That's it. 81 pages. The U.S. Army got 79 volumes. The U.S. Merchant Marine got 81 pages. And I could write a page about every ship that was lost. That's 733 pages right there. I could write, a paragraph about the 9,500 mariners, and I can give you books on that. And again, we get kind of lost because, again, we do a terrible job about that. Give you the last tidbit here. The Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard are great at doing these documents, these strategies, these concepts. This is the newest one, Advantage at Sea, prevailing with integrated all-domain naval power. What they do and what they fail to do consistently since they've started doing these documents is leave out the commercial aspect. They do what Andrew Lambert talked about in that first article I pointed to you about, is what's the purpose of a Navy? If your whole purpose of the Navy is to throw Tomahawk cruise missiles and Trident ballistic missiles and basically aircraft at an enemy, then we're great. You know, the U.S. Navy is #1 in the world. It's fantastic. The problem is our merchant marine is number 21 in the world. China's Navy is number 2. Their merchant marine, if you add up their merchant marine with Hong Kong, because they basically control Hong Kong now, is number 2. Who's the better sea power? Is it the U.S. with the Navy at first and the merchant marine at 21st, or the Chinese at second in both places? Now, Marriott has responded. They came out with this report right here, Goals and Objectives for a Stronger Maritime Nation, a report to Congress. But I would tell you, it's a poor substitute. It's a poor substitute. It's not done in any sort of really nice way. It's a clunky report. And I put it here, the objectives at the end, the way forward. They list 39 objectives. 39 objectives. That's a lot of objectives right there with 4 goals. And the goals are great. The problem is, how do you manifest those goals? How do you manifest those goals going forward? And, you know, one of the things we see right now is where we don't have a maritime administrator. We don't have anybody who's really leading the maritime industry in many ways. We have a lot of fights within the maritime industry, unions, shipyards, companies, you name it. We tend to be the best at in-person fighting. But we don't have is the advocate out there to really talk about the maritime industry. And I think that's one of the things we have to kind of improve on. Every one of you who's graduated from a maritime academy, you know, every one of you should be advocates for our industry, and you should be out there and you should have a good knowledge of the industry. You should be reading up on what's happening and be able to talk about it. And again, because I think one of the things we don't do is really articulate what the maritime industry does for the United States, does for the world, and does for the U.S. military in many ways. And with that, I wanted to make sure I had time. I want to open myself up for questions. 2:48. I went 3 minutes long. I apologize. I'm rusty in teaching, Will. I apologize. Wait for Will to come back on here.
Thank you, Sal. That was great. Once again, we'll open it up to questions here. If anyone has any questions. I guess I'll start off. I hope this isn't too broad of a question, but do you know of any other countries that have more successful versions of cabotage laws, things that have helped strengthen and grow their merchant marine that we could copy?
Well, I mean, one of the most successful was Britain. Britain had the most successful cabotage law in the world, and then they ended it. And so that's one of the arguments that you'll hear people make about the Jones Act. Well, you know, in 1840s, they got rid of the cabotage laws. They got rid of all these rules that did it, and they opened themselves up. They only got rid of the cabotage laws when their merchant marine was the most dominant force on the planet. That's when they got rid of it, was at that moment. Other nations have cabotage laws. Is that report that was done out there that talks about, you know, 91 nations have some version of cabotage. The difference you have with American cabotage, the one salient sticking point is the U.S. bill requirement. The U.S. bill requirement. And I would make this argument. We do not need cabotage if we're any other country other than the United States. You know, if we're any other country that needs to import goods, move goods in and out of our country, we don't need it. But because we have a military presence, because we have military forces in 150 nations, because we view ourselves as a hyperpower, you know, superior in terms of ability to project forces than anyone else on the planet, then you need a domestic merchant marine. And you don't just need the domestic merchant marine, but you need the infrastructure to support it. One of my arguments for why the Navy has such a hard time building ships right now, whether it's the Zumwalts, the LCSs, the Fords, you name it, is because we don't have a commercial building infrastructure in the United States. And that commercial building infrastructure has gone overseas. 94% of every ship on the planet is built in 4 countries. It's built in China, Korea, Japan, the Philippines. The remaining 6% are spread around the rest of the world, and no country except for those 4 have greater than 1%. And one of the things that you're seeing right now in the big three in China, Japan, and Korea, they're consolidating those shipyards. China is giving massive subsidies. There's a CSIS report out called Hidden Harbors that talks about this, how much money they're basically dumping into their infrastructure to build vessels. Korea is doing the same thing. Japan has pooled their resources together. They're doing their best to compete with Japan, with China and Korea. They don't want to be left in the dust, so to speak. So they're trying to do it. They've combined their shipping companies into ONE, this one big company now. Same thing with their yards. And again, cabotage, again, you're going to pay more in the United States. It's just the problem is we're not building ships. We build works of art. When you only build one or two ships, a year, that's a work of art. That's not a ship. It's not, if you hammer out one Model T a year, that's not assembly line process. You're not getting a scale of efficiency. You're not getting any benefit in building vessels. And the problem is we're building for the Navy, but we're not building for the commercial. So for example, we're building these oilers for the US Navy, these John Lewis oilers. NASSCO had a commercial version that they could have taken, modified into that, and built both commercial and military versions of the same vessels. That's what we did with the T3 tankers during World War II and the post-war. It's what we did with a lot of our combat replenishment vessels. They were modified maritime commission or commercial vessels. In 1950s, we had the Mariner program where we built 35 C4 Mariners. 5 of them went to the Navy. The other 30 went in the commercial service. So I think there are solutions out there. We just got to think about that. But the cabotage thing is unique. Again, China can sit there and say, hey, we're not going to have cabotage anymore. You can build your vessel anywhere. Well, if you're not Chinese built, you're not going to get in and out of, you're not going to get Chinese contracts to work in and out of Chinese ports. And by the way, they're the biggest, they undercut everybody when it comes to money right now. So they're going to get the contracts.
Thank you.
May I pose a quick question? I apologize for being 7 minutes late. I don't know whether you addressed this, but what about all the American-owned foreign flag or international registry ships? Now, I was in the international fleet myself. That's how I was able to promote myself and get enough sea time in. But these American-owned ships are there for their convenience, for marketing their freight rates and getting the cargo going, but they could just as well be under US flag. What is the pushback from the industry, and with the government maybe giving some leverage to this effort to get some of those back under US flag?
Well, I think that's a program that needs to be done. I think that's one of the things that we need to start looking at is how do we bring vessels back into the US flag, especially the international fleet, for example, where we can do that. Again, one of the things that keeps the vessels in the Maritime Security Program is $5 million. You're giving companies $5 million to do it. I'm not a big fan of subsidies. I don't like handing money out. I think that's a poor way of doing business in some ways, because I don't think you get good tracking of what that money does. And I also think it doesn't promote efficiency in any way. But I think there are ways that we can legislate very quickly laws that would make it more economical for companies to have U.S. flags. So, for example, if you're a U.S. mariner operating on an unlimited tonnage license, under a U.S. flag vessel, instead of paying you your gross salary and then, taking out the taxes and you get your net salary, the company just pays you net. They don't have to pay the taxes. They waive those federal taxes. And that's a huge relief for the companies to pay that amount of federal taxes into it. You would still get that money put aside by the government. The government doesn't have to change any money. They just basically waive your federal government taxes as you're operating on your international license. And again, those are the type of things I think we need to be talking about more. That starts bringing vessels back in. Passenger vessels. Why is there not a mandate for passenger vessels to have a required number of American crew on board if they're operating out of U.S. ports? We allow Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian to be sandwiched 20 miles from each other in southern Florida. They're incorporated in Panama, Liberia, and Bermuda. They have all these benefits in the world, yet we don't mandate that they have to hire engineers and mates. Now, there are some that do that. There are some that do it. Kate McHugh, from Cal Maritime is one of the most popular people out there doing it. But talk to Kate about her early years and how tough it was working as a third mate, working her way up through the cruise lines. It's not designed to pay a lot of money. And, you know, there was a piece in Splash not too long ago that the British were losing merchant mariners because, you know, it was they make more money as a barista in London than they do working on a ship. And so I think there has to be some new elements done to get vessels back. But the key thing is cargo. Unless the cargo is there, you're not going to get any vessels back. And unless you can guarantee cargo, that's a key thing right now. And I think, again, here's the moment where we should see the Federal Maritime Commission, the Maritime Administration talking right now, because as cargo is lined up on the docks in Los Angeles, Long Beach, and exporters can't get their cargo on board vessels right now because there's not enough room for them, or companies are taking empties back because they don't want to build containers in lieu of our exports. That should be the element right there for us to kick in. Same thing. I think, for example, building an LNG carrier is extremely cost prohibitive in the United States. I think it'd be very expensive for us to start an LNG program right now in the United States. And there's no surprise we don't have LNG carriers. Again, LNG doesn't start being exported in the United States until 2016 in any sort of amount. But there should be an ability to flag in LNG carriers into the U.S. registry with a temporary Jones Act waiver, maybe for 5 to 10 years. And then you put a surcharge on LNG exported on foreign flag, a very small surcharge, but a money that can be used to pool up and fund Title 11 shipbuilding loans to build LNGs in the United States. But again, this requires a strategy that doesn't have 39 objectives and is more laid out than what you see in front of you right here. I recommend everyone take a look at that document and read it, but it's not a coherent document, in my opinion. I don't know if that answered your question, Ralph. I apologize.
No, I appreciate that. I've heard the same sentiments when I was working on cruise ships under Panama flag, with people striking on the pier in New York, thinking they would get those same jobs. It was never going to happen.
No, and it's not going to happen until you make it happen. And that's the thing with the companies. Again, you know, one of the things we see is I would argue that RCL, NCL, and Carnival can't argue that they can't afford it. If they can suck up $1 billion a month loss right now in not running passengers, they can pay a little bit more for crews, you know, to put aside some billets for American mariners and on board their vessels. I don't think that's the issue that needs to go. But again, this needs to be articulated. It needs to be advocated. And what you see right now is the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, playing catch up right now. They're really not, I would argue, being very, very proactive. They're being reactive. And unfortunately, their reaction is too far behind what needs to be done right now. And I'm happy, I was just looking at the chat room here. I'm happy to provide this. I'll give a copy of it to Will so he can disseminate it for everybody.
Hi, Sal. Maggie here.
Hey, Maggie.
You mentioned earlier that there were issues with building new ships to be a part of the Ready Reserve Force, as well as some issues potentially with buying older ships. I was wondering if you could expand on that, what your thoughts are on it.
Sure. So basically the plan that's been put forward is basically a repeat of the 1990s to build vessels to go into the reserve fleet and to buy on the commercial market available car carriers and suitable ro-ros out there. So my issue with this is a couple. Number one, vessels that were bought in the 1990s, you know, to go in the RRF fleet are a lot different. 1990s built ships are a lot different than modern built ships, even post 2000. Steel work is different. Quality is different. Just look at the Golden Ray that rolled over in Brunswick, and that vessel has to be scrapped in place because it's you know, it can't take that damage. You know, I've got friends who sail for a car carrier company. I won't name which one. But, you know, when you load cars in the upper deck of those vessels, you got to open all the doors, the staterooms, or else they buckle, you know, and it's just, it's not a question of poor building. It's they're built to different standards than we have. So, you know, how well can those vessels handle M1 tanks? I don't know. One of the big problems is the military went out and surveyed all those vessels. And so everybody knows what those vessels are, and they're going to cost you more than you think they're going to cost right now because they know that. Number two, I hate building vessels to lay them up for no good reason. You know, the LMSRs, I was part of that program when we built them, and there was a lot of issues with that program, and I could write a whole book about that. But, you know, I'd much rather have an active reserve fleet than a inactive reserve fleet. You know, I think if we're going to build, you know, medium-sized roll-on, roll-off vessels, then let's lease them out to commercial companies to operate on these maritime highways that the Maritime Administration always talks about. You know, let's run them up the I-5, I-95 corridor and move cargo that way. You know, one of the biggest reasons ships, you're not doing that right now is, number one, there's no Jones Act ships that can do that. Second, it's too much money up front to do it. The upfront costs are too prohibitive. But if the US government builds the vessels, leases them, basically operates like a U-Haul, leases them to companies, those vessels would still be available should we need them in time of war. You're training them, you're generating revenue, you're operating a vessel, which is a heck of a lot better than leaving it sitting in you know, in the water, just rusting away. I think you can create jobs. The problem is you have to sell that. You have to be able to sell that. And one of the things that sells is it sells US shipbuilding, number one. It sells, you know, employment. You're increasing trade and traffic. You're getting high, you know, cargo off the highways. You know, the Jones Act makes this, the guys who oppose the Jones Act make the same argument, but they say, let's just use foreign ships and foreign vessels to do this, which again is fine. If your bottom line is cost, which is what theirs is, then you're exactly right. The cost is much cheaper to do that. But if your argument is national defense, which is what the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, 36, 70, and all the other ones talk about, then you need to build a program that's a little bit different. The British did this with what they call their point class Sealift. They basically got a commercial builder to build some vessels, and they give them some money, and those vessels are available for use in time of war. And in the meantime, they operate them as commercial vessels in and around the EU. And I don't think there's a reason not to do that. We have a hard time selling short sea shipping in the United States because it's hard to get in ports right now. It's you know, I can have all the short sea shipping I want. I can't get into Long Beach or Los Angeles right now. I mean, I just can't. So, you know, what good does that do me if I can't get in there? And even if I can get in there, I got to deal with the Pacific Maritime Association, which is controlled by largely foreign companies who have the majority of the votes to get in there to get working gangs. So again, there's a lot to look at. And one of the things that I'm hoping for is the Biden administration gets moving on a MARAD administrator here fairly soon that can really make some changes and everything. I think Busby was a good maritime administrator, but he was more military than commercial. I think we need somebody commercial to do it. You know, the FAA is usually run by a pilot. You know, the head of the maritime administration is not usually led by a merchant marine master or chief engineer, which would be nice.
Do you have any?
Sal, you just mentioned before about how the marine highway is so important, and it does add a lot of value. And certainly, you know, the bottom line is certainly also important. Even if we're able to have more vessels and we're using the marine highway, which I'm an advocate for, you know, you brought up the point about, great, once I get into port, anytime as a manufacturer, anytime that I may save or even in a reduction in cost, I'm going to lose as soon as I get into port because I can't get it through quickly enough. Right. So how do we get around some of that?
Well, I think, again, that goes to this consolidation we've seen, not just in the United States, but everywhere. We know that, you know, in the maritime industry, one of the reasons why I talk about this a lot is, you know, we don't exist in the mainstream of most people. You can't see ships. You can't go, except for cruise lines. You don't see that. You don't see the ports. You don't see where the cargo is handling. We've consolidated into these huge, massive terminals that no one can see and no one can get into. And I think one of the things that needs to be sold to smaller towns, smaller outposts, you know, and you know, communities, is the development of smaller ports. You know, that's where you're going to go. Again, you're not going to get into the main terminal in Alameda. You're not going to get into Tacoma. You're not going to get into Long Beach, Los Angeles. You're competing against them. It's almost impossible to do that. You've got to go and find alternatives to go into. Is it Port Hueneme? Is it ports that have been used in the past that are not being used right now? The problem is that real estate is so expensive. It's just, it's so cost prohibitive to do that. Somebody mentioned the longshoremen. You got to deal with the unions. You got to deal with the movement of cargo with the unions. And this is why when they make the argument about, you know, moving cargo from Seattle to Los Angeles being cheaper, it's like, you got to go through those ports. And if you got to go through those ports, you're double handling. You can't get them off the terminals right now. I mean, that's the biggest problem, is shortage of chassis, you know, shortage of trucks, shortage of drivers. all those elements that makes it just cheaper to just put it on one truck and move it than it is anything else. And again, I think this is where it needs to be looked holistically. I mean, it doesn't just need to be the maritime industry. It needs to be ground transportation, it needs to be air transportation. Again, one of the things we've done over the course of the creation of the federal government is create these little, secretariats that look at things different. Why is commerce separate from transportation? It really shouldn't be. It kind of goes hand in hand. You got to have the two of them together. You need labor, you need the interior, you need all those elements together. And unfortunately, especially in the maritime industry, we've created a positions in the FMC and in the Maritime Administration that have almost no power associated with them. The FAA administrator is God to the aviation industry. He has power. He has the ability to do things. Whereas in the maritime sector, he really doesn't, or she doesn't. And I think that's a big flaw, and it makes it very difficult to enact changes. Again, everybody wants to do these big, huge, massive changes. They want to do this, all-encompassing changes. And I think we have to start seeing small changes done on local levels to see things done. So, for example, I always use the state of Virginia. State of Virginia and the I-64 corridor going from Richmond to Newport News and Norfolk down there. They wanted to get traffic off the road. The I-64 is a narrow little road. It's not huge. And there were tractor trailers jamming it up. And they created a tug and barge program with the incentive to put, cargo on barges and move it down the James River. It's worked. It's worked on a small scale. And I think on a state scale, we have to see those things done before we can get it done on a national scale in some ways. Anybody else? Talk to you guys your ears off. I have that ability.
Do you have anyone in mind that you think would be a great maritime administrator, for
Not
example?
me. Not me. Anybody but me.
I think you'd be a good one.
I will not. I will not be a good maritime administrator by any means. I would be frustrated and I'd be terrible at it. No, I think I think one of the things we got to look at is again, we tend to look for the same group to be in charge. And again, I thought Admiral Busby did a great job, but he's an admiral. And again, he's got that Navy focus on it. I wrote a piece for CIMSEC, the Center for International Maritime Security, that got me in a little bit of trouble because I made the argument that Military Sealift Command, that arm of the Navy that employs merchant mariners, should have merchant mariners in the chain of command.
Yeah.
I think that's important to do and everything. And I got to, I didn't make everybody happy with that and everything. I don't think I'm going to get an invite to MSC anytime soon about that. I will also argue at times that, merchant mariners aren't always the right solution either. Grabbing a guy from the deck of, bridge of a ship for 30 years or from the, the deck plates of an engine room and putting him in the boardroom is not always the best transition. It doesn't always go very well. One of the things that I'm always amazed of, if you look at international shipping companies, you look at the Maersk and CMA and you look at the big ones out there, they have a mix. They got the seafarers in there, but at the same time, they got the business school. They got the different elements in there. They get people from outside. They get the innovators out there. Why is it we don't have a Shark Tank for maritime innovation in the United States? They do in Rotterdam. They do in Europe all the time. Let me bring you my idea of how to invest money into the maritime sector, and let me get some funding going here. That's kind of what we need. You need a much different approach. I always argued that if Amazon creates a shipping line, that'd be the best one, because they would figure out, because their end goal isn't the ships, it's the delivery. It's the delivery. If you go into a shipping company, everywhere there's model of ships. This is their ship. You see models of ships everywhere. You go into FedEx, I don't think there's models of trucks, and everyone, because the truck doesn't matter. It's the delivery. It's getting it to the end purpose. And you need that mix. The problem is, if you just do it purely business wise, you lose an element, because you need that maritime element in there. That's why I think, grads from Cal Maritime in the business sector, in the maritime infrastructure and maritime transportation, even on the engineering side, are so crucial, because you need them in those boardrooms. You need them in those decision-making roles. But at the same time, you need people outside who bring that element to it. And again, I think too often we look at the same group of people and we ask, expect them to have the answers. Well, you're a general, you're an admiral. Give me your guidance and your wisdom, and that's not always going to work the same. So, I think it's not just and I should say it's not just going to be a maritime administrator. It's going to be the deputies he or she brings with them, what kind of group they're going to put together, what kind of marching orders they're going to be given, what's the Secretary of Transportation going to tell them to do? What's Secretary Buttigieg going to tell them to do? If he's going to tell them, okay, you're on a very narrow leash and you can't do too much, well, then it's going to really hinder them. But I think I will argue this, we're at a tipping point. I think we're at a very critical tipping point, because I think one of the things we're about to see is the further decrease of the U.S. commercial fleet. I mean, it's at that point. You're not building a lot of vessels, and it has the potential to go away. And I know we don't like to talk about that, but that was that piece I wrote about, suppose there was a war and the merchant marine didn't come. That's the potential. And then we face ourselves with the prospect of what the British did in 2003, where they basically had to go on the open exchange, the Baltic exchange, to get vessels to haul their cargo to Iraq, which is fine. You can do that. But you then run the risk of what the Canadians ran into in 99, where they put all their gear from a peacekeeping operation in Bosnia on a ship called the GTS Katy from, I think it was like St. Kitts, or I can't remember what flag it was. But the vessel refused to sail into Halifax because it was worried about being arrested. So the Canadians had to go out and forcibly board the vessel and bring it into a port to get their equipment back for their armed forces, because it was floating on a vessel off their coast, out of their control. Again, commercial wise, it doesn't matter. As long as my socks and t-shirts arrive, I don't care who hauls it. But if it's my tanks, my ammunition, and more importantly, my sophisticated military equipment, I may be a little more concerned about putting on a vessel I don't know where it's going to go after it leaves.
A quick question, Sal.
Yes, sir.
It's something that's only tangentially touching on our topic here, but if you're on a merchant ship in the South China Sea and between Japan and China, China is our next big competitor. And we're talking about our allies there. So if you're on a ship and you see these North Korean missiles arcing overhead and plopping down into the Sea of Japan, you start to get concerned. And our former president did send 4 guided missile destroyers into that area on patrol, so he said. My hope all along was that they were going to do some target practice, and once these missiles had reached international airspace, they would start shooting them down, and thereby also give an indirect and very clear message to China not to meddle in international shipping and threatening our allies. Now, I don't know whether you've heard anything in this regard, Sal, but I felt very strongly about it, that was the real reason those 4 guided missile vessels were sent there in the first place, to actually shoot them down. What's your comment?
I mean, obviously the ballistic missile defense program, both afloat and ashore, is a vital thing. I think one of the things that you touch base on, Ralph, if you don't mind, I'm going to pivot a little bit on this one, and just because I think it raises a very interesting question, is you're talking about China, you're talking about North Korea, you're talking about the whole East Asia area right there. China, if you look at China today, a lot of people will look at what China's doing in the South China Sea, the very aggressiveness, excuse me, excuse me, talking a bit, get a drink. North Korea is obviously, a military threat. They are just a pure military threat. I think China is not just a military threat; it's an economic threat. If you look at what they do in the South China Sea, a lot of people look at that and they say, "Oh, that's just base building. They're just, intimidating and everything like that." Everything China does is to protect their trade routes. Everything they do, everything that you go back and read Lincoln Payne's, Sea and Civilization. Look at what China did in the 13th, 14th century. Everything China does is subservient to the larger good of what keeps China economically viable. Development in the South China Sea, the Belt and Road Initiative, everything you want to call it, but even that, their development into the Arctic Ocean, to South Pacific, that's in case of a closed choke point, as the case would ever given, they can move cargo in different ways. What they're terrified of doing is being cut off. They're terrified of being cut off. And because they had that experience, they had it with the Western powers, with imperialism in the late 1800s, when Western Army marched into Peking in 1900. They had it with the UN Army on their border in 1950 in the Koreas. They had it with the Japanese closing their ports and cutting them off from the outside world in the 1930s and 40s. And I think, again, this puts us in a position: do we want to be dependent on all our shipping being built in Japan, Korea, and China. And, you know, I have no prospect of Japan or Korea not being our ally. I'm 100% clear about that. But if a conflict happens in the world, it'll happen in East Asia probably, you know, and if you look at what the genesis for the Jones Act was in 1920, it was the outbreak of a war in Southeast Europe, you know, and basically we kept out of the war for 3 years until our shipping got torpedoed and we got thrust into the unrestricted submarine warfare role, and we went into World War I. You know, what happens over Taiwan? What happens between Korea and Japan? What happens between China and the Philippines? You know, and again, if you have an East Asia war, what's the prospect for that? And so, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why you see the U.S. military in such a position. But again, I think the U.S. military has forgotten what it's like to fight a war across the Pacific. The Pacific is not the Persian Gulf. It is not 300 miles from one end of the Persian Gulf to the other. It's 7,000 miles across the Pacific. That tyranny of distance is going to be a problem for them if they have to figure out how to supply their fleet, you know, from Pearl, from Guam, or from the West Coast, or through the Panama Canal if they have to. So I think that's one of the reasons why you see the U.S. Navy being proactive in that. You know, they're trying to deter because, again, deterrence is a lot better than an actual shooting war.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.